Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup d'être venu en personne ou de vous être plugué en ligne pour cette conférence. Donc, on va parler de l'Union européenne. Peut-elle imposer un salaire minimum? Titre un peu accrocheur afin de vous attirer. Donc, on aura la chance d'avoir avec nous le professeur Thorsten Schulten. Je vais le laisser se présenter lui-même parce que, comme je l'ai dit, j'aurai beaucoup de misère à prononcer le nom et de son université et de son centre de recherche. Mais c'est un spécialiste quand même de l'Union européenne, de l'impact sur le dialogue social et le salaire minimum en Europe. Donc, il nous fera une présentation. Deux informations techniques. Donc, pour que vous sachiez, la présentation sera enregistrée et sera disponible par la suite sur les médias sociaux. Et l'autre élément, Thorsten va tenter de prévoir en cours de présentation, là, au milieu de la présentation, une petite période de questions et d'échanges pour la première partie, si vous avez des questions d'éclaircissement. Mais on a prévu à la fin de la présentation une période de discussion. Je me rends compte que je ne me suis pas présenté. Donc, Pierre-Antoine Harvé, nouvellement professeur à l'École de relations industrielles de l'Université de Montréal. Donc, il va me faire plaisir d'animer cette session-ci. Et je vous passe tout de suite la parole à Thorsten, qui, bien sûr, va s'adresser à vous en anglais. Merci beaucoup. Welcome, Thorsten.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous. I'm afraid here stops my French already, so I'm able to understand. So if you feel better to put your questions, it might be okay. But to speak, I'm probably would not be so entertaining for you. So I will talk in English. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you very much for the invitation. Actually, I had the opportunity to have a 4-month stay now in North America, both in Canada and the US. I started here in Montreal with it in the beginning of July with the SACE conference. And this is also my final stop. So I will go back to Germany at the beginning next week. So this is also my last event, so to speak, official event. So thanks for having me. And yeah, let's start with the presentation. Well, maybe 1 or 2 words on myself. So I don't know if you're all familiar with the institute I'm coming from. It's called the Institute for Economic and Social Research at the Hans Böckler Foundation. It's basically the Hans Böckler Foundation is the foundation of the German trade unions. So it's very close to them. And we are the research institute within that foundation. My particular task here is I'm the scientific head of the so-called Collective Agreement Archive. So we are collecting all major collective agreements in Germany, doing regular evaluations, monitoring, statistics, whatsoever. I have a couple of slides doing some advertisement in my presentation, so you will see. I will also give you the info. So most of the thing, of course, we have on at the web. So the question which was kindly put to me is, can the European Union impose a minimum wage? The impact of the EU minimum wage directive. And I intend to, or I will talk basically about 4 points. First of all, I want to give you a brief overview about the background and what is this EU minimum wage directive about. And since it's basically about 2 things, I will talk about them as well. The first thing is the approach to adequate minimum wages. So what are adequate minimum wages? What is an adequate level is the second part. And the third part, and that's an equal target of that directive, is the strengthening of collective bargaining. So how to come to a coverage rate of 80%. This is to a certain way the benchmark given in that directive, and I will talk about that. Yeah, and finally, I allow myself also to have some thoughts about the US and Canada, why the debate on sectoral bargaining, in my view, is the right debate here. But I have to say on Canada, I probably have more questions to you than answers. So, but I will see that we come into a discussion. So, and as you said before, please feel free if you have really any questions in between the presentation, just go for it, and I can always interrupt and then come back to my presentation. Or maybe we can also make, after every block, we can have a short break and see if there are any questions and or comments on what I have said. Well, yeah, so I start with the first part, the EU Minimum Wage Directive, a little bit about the background. And I mean, those who are familiar with the research on European integration, they know there is a widespread view that we have a fundamental asymmetry in European integration, asymmetry between economic integration on the one hand and social or political integration on the other hand. So European integration is basically about markets, about creating markets, about liberalization policy, and so on. And that, of course, is not always easy for trade unions, since trade unions and labor in general are set into competition within the internal European market. And we had also quite a very traditional neoliberal view, which was dominant in EU policy on minimum wages and collective bargaining, which saw minimum wages and collective bargaining basically as a constraint to the adaptability of capital. And someone coming in? Come in, hi. Yes, no problem. So in general, the minimum wages and collective bargaining were not seen more seen as a threat to price competitiveness. And if you think back a little bit to the big financial crisis at the end of the 2000s, and which also then led to a euro crisis in the early 2010, I would say there was even a kind of radicalization of these neoliberal policies in Europe. And the best expression here is perhaps these so-called Troika programs on especially Eastern and Southern European countries. The Troika is composed by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, which was also involved here. And they also made these so-called reform programs. So in exchange that countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, others got money, got some credits from that international institution. In exchange, they had to sign a so-called memorandum of understanding, including a reform program. And in all these reform programs, there were a lot of things on labor market issues, of course, and there were also recommendations, so to speak, on minimum wages and collective bargaining in the way that minimum wages should be freezed or even cut, and that collective bargaining should be decentralized. And there was one famous labor market report in 2012 from the European Commission, which already called literally about the overall reduction of wage setting power of trade unions. So this was explicitly named as a name. Against that background, if we now look then to the European Minimum Wage Directive, we see really almost a completely change. I would even call it a paradigm shift in the discourse on collective bargaining and minimum wage. So the directive, it was initially set on the agenda in 2019 with at that time EU Commission, and it has been adopted in 2022, and we are now still in the implementation process. And the interesting thing here is that we have a completely new view on minimum wages and collective bargaining, which now seen basically as a positive instrument, positive to achieve social goals, as allow for decent living, reducing in-work poverty, reducing inequality more in general, but also in terms of economic goals, so to provide fair competition, to allow for more stable, inclusive economic development. And finally, even about political goals, to stabilize society, in particular in times of crisis, and to strengthen support for European integration. So the question is, why was that change? And that would be, of course, a different talk. Just to let you know that, of course, this radicalization of crisis policy at EU level at the beginning of the 2010s led to an enormous delegitimization of the European integration project as such. We saw that everywhere in Europe we have right-wing parties. They were also very anti-European. We had the Brexit as probably the most obvious example of the crisis of EU integration. And it was even for more conservative policymakers at EU level, it becomes clear that they had to do something in order to increase the legitimation and acceptance of European integration. And therefore, the whole question of social Europe suddenly, since the second half of the 2010s, become prominent again. One expression was the adoption of the so-called European social pillar of European integration in 2017. This was a big set of social targets, social rights, but they were not binding at all. So it was just a kind of nice declaration that you want to do it, but without any substance that time. But after the adoption of that pillar, the EU started to create a new social action program with a couple of more progressive directives, legal approaches of different issues. And probably the one which is most important for trade unions has been this one on the European Minimum Wage Directive. So that's probably just on the background. And yeah, this is the first advertisement blog. If you want to know more about the background of all these and why this happened, and also with which constellations were able that we got this directive, I would recommend this article to you. By the way, if you're interested, of course, you can distribute the presentation among the participants. So yeah, so I don't know, before I, interestingly, this new view on minimum wages and collective bargaining was not only at the EU level, but we found it also in other regions and other organizations. And probably one very important thing here is the OECD. The OECD was, as you might know, traditionally one of the core neoliberal think tanks. If you look back to the OECD employment guidelines of the 1990s, you had all these negative things. Minimum wages were not good. They made a clear plea for decentralization of collective bargaining and so on. So there was all these neoliberal philosophy that we need more flexibility, that the constraints of this institution as well. And also the OECD, I would say, have really more fundamentally changed its view on these issues. And the most, I think the most clear expression for this is perhaps this report negotiating our wage up on collective bargaining. I think it's from 2019. Where they really developed a much more differentiated view on collective bargaining in particular, and they came to the result that countries with a higher, more comprehensive bargaining tend to be better in fighting inequality, promoting inclusive growth, and mastering economic crisis, but also economic transition, which we're on in a much better way than countries where they have only very weak bargaining system. So this was a very important change. And finally, I would say there are also a couple of different countries outside of Europe where at least sometimes even political initiatives, but at least discussions started also on strengthening of collective bargaining. And that means in particular strengthening of sectoral bargaining. I come back to that point, of course. But here we have all the Anglo-Saxon countries. I also understood that in Canada you have quite interesting debate on that. You have even in Latin America, you have some countries which try to promote and to reconstruct the collective bargaining system. And even in the US, I mean, I have been there now for 3 months studying the US and the debate there. I mean, at least, of course, not at the federal level with Trump. That's, of course, quite difficult, but at the level of federal states, you have some very interesting developments. I just recommend you a special issue of the International Labor Review, which is from the ILO, the scientific journal, which had a special, I think it was the last issue of 2024. They had a special issue on these multi-level, sector level collective bargaining system, what they might call a revival of multi-employer bargaining. So you see that the whole thing was in a and the final point, and then I stop here already for the first block. So basically, this directive have two fundamental goals, which I intend to speak about. First is the promotion of adequate wage level, minimum wage levels, and secondly, it's the promotion of collective bargaining. Interestingly, the original draft of this initiative was only talking about minimum wages. And then it was in particular the European Trade Union Organization who said, well, if you talk about minimum wages, you also have to talk about collective bargaining, of course. And there is a strong need to strengthen bargaining because the real minimum wages are not set by the state, but by the unions too. So therefore, they were able to manage to bring that point in so that we have almost two equal goals, main goals. Yeah, may I stop here for a minute? If there are already questions, I'm fine. If not, of course, I continue talking, but...
Thank you, Thorsten. Is there any question in the room, dans la salle, or online? You can raise your little yellow hand if you have any question for now. Not.
Well, I continue then. So the second block is I want to talk a little bit more about adequate minimum wages. What is an adequate level? And here, first of all, have to give an answer to your question, which you put to me. Can the European Union impose a minimum wage? Clear answer, no, it cannot. So sorry about that. So I can go.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you very much, guys. Okay, of course, I have to explain that a little bit. That is a very tricky thing because the more fundamental question, whether or not the EU has the competence to set up such a directive, is highly contested. It has always tried from the beginning. It is contested. And unfortunately, there is also an ongoing case at the European Court of Justice, and the European Court will decide on 11th November. So I was really happy because when we made this event here, when we planned it, it was not clear when the court was deciding on it. And I was afraid that he would decide it more early, so he might kill it, and I would have to talk about a subject which doesn't exist anymore in a certain way. That would be not so nice. So we will see what the outcome is. So it is very clear that the EU has no legal competence neither to determine a certain EU-wide minimum wage level, so they can't do that, or, and that's also what they're doing, a single harmonized way of minimum wage setting. So this directive, you might know, you still have a couple of countries in Europe which have no statutory minimum wage. And these are in particular the Nordic states, which have very strong bargaining system, with a very high coverage of 90% or more. And here, everyone, including politics, employers, but even the union said, we do not want to have statutory minimum wage because we are able, by our own power, to make sure that everyone has an adequate minimum wage level. So, and therefore, it was also quite clear that it was not about harmonizing the minimum wage setting system. So there is no competence. What the directive is doing, it is more defining some more general procedure, mainly procedural rules, how to set up a statutory minimum wage setting. And they also gave some criteria what might be an adequate minimum wage level, but without, in the end, defining a clear target that you have to fulfill this. So I think the most important criteria dimension is the so-called indicative reference value, so that they said, according to international debates, an adequate minimum wage level should be at least 60% of the gross median wage or 50% of the gross average wage. That's also in the directive, but it is not a binding criteria, but it's more what I might call a strong recommendation. And this has to do with the legal uncertainty of this directive. And that's probably, so that I would interpret it as a way that the European Commission went as far as it could go, but to make this criteria binding would probably be the step too far, then the legal question would be raised on the table. Nevertheless, these indicative reference value play in the meantime in the policy, minimum wage policy of many European countries, it plays a crucial role. So the countries have even adopted, some have even taken this reference value to their national law. So they transform this more soft law recommendation here at the EU level towards a hard law aim of their national minimum wage. That also means that the outcome, this is true for the minimum wage, but also for the collective bargaining issue I will talk about later, it depends very much on the national level and the struggles at the national level. So this is a core issue. So, and if we look a little bit to the figures, these are the figures of 2024. Here you find the statutory minimum wage of these countries. It has a percentage of either the median wage or the average wage. And you can see on one line, there are only 2 countries which so far have fulfilled these recommendations, recommended targets. These are France and Slovenia, with a minimum wage of as percent of the median wage of more than 60% of median wage, more than 50% of average wage. All the other countries are far above that target. I also took I think the figures for Canada also. So also Canada, if you would have this thing here, the average minimum wage. I know that you have a provincial system with different levels, but if you take the average thing and if you compare that, I think that's what the OECD was calculating here, then you will also be quite far above these EU target. So, which means that if every country in Europe with a statutory minimum wage would fulfill these targets, there would be a significant increase of minimum wages for most workers. So that's the intent. And that's the process at the moment we are in. And I said, there are a couple of countries, interestingly, especially in Eastern Europe, who took that target and include them in their national national minimum wage legislation. In Germany, for instance, where I come from, I mean, we also demand of putting the 60% median wage in the German minimum wage law, which we haven't achieved yet. But what we have achieved is that we have a commission composed by employers and trade unions who regularly make recommendations for adjustment of the minimum wage. And they put at their criteria, which they put themselves, they already use the 60% criteria. So I think that's pretty successful. And the interesting thing here is there is already a policy process happening and it has already an impact. So even if the European Court of Justice in the end would kill this directive, it still will have its effect and it will continue to have its effect. So that's a positive thing. Well, that's already the second point. There are any question here? So can stop here.
Are both parts of the directive being challenged in the court, both the collective bargaining part and the others?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So maybe I say another word to the challenge. The challenge comes interestingly from Sweden and Denmark. So it is sounds a little bit strange that the social democratic with the best development, but there is a structural problem because in these are very exceptional countries, also regarding their labor relation systems. And so one exception or one major feature of their system is that they have almost all labor and social regulation is not done by the state, but by collective bargaining. And now if Europe comes and define regulation by the state, it does not fit to their system. And they are afraid, I think probably a little bit, the critique is a little bit too much because we don't see really an impact of this directive on these countries yet. But they felt afraid that such a statutory regulation would weaken their system of autonomous collective bargaining. That's the argument basically. And then they use the legal argument now to say, well, the EU has no competence. That's what's going on, right? Well, yeah.
And is there a theoretical reason to have two indicators which are pretty similar? Is there a debate between those two? Or
the reason, that's a very good question. Yes, there is a reason, and that has to do with the fact that only looking to the median wage is probably not sufficient for all countries. It's in particular not sufficient for countries where the overall wage level is very low. And if the median wage already is very low, sometimes it's even below what you might call a living wage, then of course 60% from a very low wage, even a lower wage, does not fit. And that was since they were not able to agree on a general living wage definition. There is also some criteria in the directive saying minimum wage should fit the costs of living and so on, but it's very vague. So it's not very much defined. So you might read a kind of living wage idea out of it, but it's rather vague. So they were not able. But more pragmatically, since some countries, for example, Bulgaria and Portugal, which seem to have been very close to the 60%, but they are the states with a relatively low median wage. So, and they said, well, this criteria is not sufficient for us. Let's have what might be another criteria. And they put in then this more pragmatic thing. And you see everywhere where you have quite a big difference between median and average wage, there you see that you really have a problem, and the median wage itself is not sufficient. So that is the background for that.
Last quick question. Germany, the council, they adopted both criteria, or
in Germany that's also interesting. Some countries only look to, so more the Eastern European countries, they usually you look to the average wage criteria, while more the Western countries look more to the median. And in Germany, the debate is very much dominated by this medium wage thing. So the Commission adopted this 60% target, and we are still debating. And some unions, also myself, I made a proposal to include the 60% in the German minimum wage law. But there is some resistance because, I mean, of course, all these things were always all very much contested and struggled. And the business community was, you could imagine, was very much against it, especially German Employees Association. They were really, and they're still against it. So they try to block wherever they can. So it's still an ongoing struggle.
Thank you.
Right.
Do you know what is the model which is used by the IMF? Because when they come to countries, they have the so-called structural adjustment programs.
Right.
So does the IMF use the average or the median or something like that? I know that they have a criteria.
Right. My feeling is that, I mean, there were a couple of IMF studies, more recent studies, we were more differentiated, more positive on minimum wages than they've been 10 years before.
Okay.
So in the past, there were very much, most of the analysis were following very classical, neoclassical approach, and always came to the result, well, minimum wages are bad for employment. I mean, that was, for a long time, it was an established fact. But since 2000, I would say it changed already, and especially in the last decade, also they had to take more differentiated view here, but I don't know if they really at the moment have a clear-cut model where they follow their policy recommendations. Well, but I think the EU minimum wage might, and the EU minimum wage directive plus the OECD, the change of their view, I think that they had a big influence also on all the other international organizations, because of course they're referring to each other and they're taking the stuff from that. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So I will talk about probably maybe the even more important or at least equal important goal of this directive, which is strengthening of collective bargaining, how to come to a coverage rate of 80%. And I will take you. So first of all, what's in the directive? Again, the EU has not competence to say you have to have this bargaining system and you have to make these or that measure. They don't have the competence. So the only thing what they can do is to give very general statements, recommendations, and adjust a procedural procedure how to increase bargaining coverage. So they have first of all, they named this goal, which is good because therefore now almost everywhere in Europe, the question of collective bargaining and how to strengthen is on the political agenda. So this is a good thing as such. And then they come with very general recommendations, of course, capacity building of social partners organization. And then you find here already this, it's just a side sentence, in particular at sector and cross industry level. And I will come back to that point why this particular sectoral level is of big importance. Okay, these are the classical demands, but the main procedure they agree on is, and here the 80% benchmark is coming, so to speak. The directive says that every country in Europe where the collective bargaining coverage is below 80%, they have to set up an action plan with concrete instruments, time schedules on how to increase the bargaining coverage. So they are totally free in which instruments they use, but they have to set up this action plan. They have to do it until the end of this year. So this is a time frame. So we have seen now in many countries a debate about what the action plan should be about. For instance, in Germany, the German trade unions, they made a 20 bullet point list of what they all want to have. So they put everything in it. Probably won't make clear, but these action plans have to be adapted. There should be, as the directive said, a clear timeline, concrete measures, and the whole thing would be reviewed and also monitored also by the European Commission, will then compare what's going on. So there will be a really exciting development from next year on. Myself also, I'm doing together with a colleague from the European Trade Union Institute, we're doing also a research project on looking to all these action plans and comparing that. So that's one of the research project I will go for in future. So what does that mean in practice? Here you see, first of all, the very general development of bargaining coverage in the European Union on the average. So yeah, you can see the last figure here. So it was, so if you look back to the early 1990s, we still had these 80%. So this was not that long time ago. But since then, we see, at least on average in the EU, we see a continuous decline. And today, according to the most recent figures, they come also from the OECD, we talk about roughly 2/3 of the workers in the European Union are still on average covered by a collective agreement. However, if you look to the individual countries in the EU, you will see, and that's the next slide, that the picture is totally diverse. So we have a range from, let's say, 12% in Poland up to, yeah, they call it 100% in Italy and Belgium. one remark on the figures, the OECD itself said these are estimations. So, and they are not harmonized figures, but they are different national figures being together. So you really have to look at them as recommendations. And there might be some figures like the 100% in Italy, which you could criticize, which I think you need to criticize. But nevertheless, it gives you the range. So that's clear. And you see there's a really a broad range. You see also Canada and the US within that, if I took the right figure, hopefully. And if we now have the 80% criteria within the EU, you see the majority of 17 out of 27 states have currently bargaining coverage below 80%. So they are obliged now to set up such an action plan to increase it. And that's a debate which is also on. Well, the interesting question, of course, is what explains this difference? What is it? And as good trade unionists, as we hopefully all are, we say, of course, the first idea would be it has to do with union power. That's of course. So the next slide, you see the relation between the bargaining coverage and the union density. Probably is a little bit confusing, so I try to cluster it a little bit. You have two clusters here. One cluster is a cluster of countries, in particular countries from Eastern Europe, but I would say also the US and maybe also Canada is part of that cluster. If you would put that in comparison to European countries, where you have a relatively low union density and a relatively low coverage. So both fit together. Then you have a very small and exceptional group where you have a high union density and a high coverage. These are in particular the Nordic states where you know they have these particular system, what you might call the Ghent systems. Unions are administrating unemployment insurance, and therefore workers have a quite high incentive to. That's, I would say, still the major explanation. There probably might be some other explanation. Maybe you got some water. So, and then the interesting thing is probably we have a third cluster, and the third cluster are countries where you have a very high bargaining coverage, but still a more small, quite low union density. So, and here you see that it could be it is not only union power which plays a role here, but there are also other issues, other institutions. And I want to draw your attention at least to two institutions. First of all, the bargaining level. So we roughly distinct between sectoral bargaining, multi-employer bargaining, and company bargaining levels. So what is a dominant form of collective bargaining? And you see all the countries with a higher bargaining coverage, they all have sectoral bargaining, or sometimes even cross-sectoral bargaining. So, and this would lead to my thesis, you won't get a majority of workers covered by collective agreement without sectoral bargaining. That's quite clear. To just a poor company bargaining system, you might have good results in some companies where you're strong. That's probably the Canadian system with a relatively high union density. And you're managed, of course, there where you're organized to have strong agreements, but for the rest, you don't have anything. So that's a problem, I think, with the system, where all the countries with a social company bargaining, you probably got up to 1/3 of the workforce, but 2/3 are not covered, roughly speaking. And there is another issue which is important, and that's the question to what extent also the state or the society in a broader sense, politics, supports a strong bargaining system. And here I already talk about the Ghent system, which is but very exceptional to a few Nordic states plus Belgium, where the city of Ghent is in Belgium and where it's originally come from. I think probably even more important is the frequent use of extension of collective agreements or functional instruments. Therefore, I'm interested in the decree system in Quebec to understand that. So that's a little bit the background for that. And you see again, all the countries with a very high of more than 2/3 of the workers covered by collective agreement they all have sectoral bargaining, and they either have the state support through extension mechanism or through the Ghent system. So and some countries have even both, like Finland and Belgium. They have the Ghent system plus extension of all the important agreements. So that is, my conclusion from that would be, in order to affect a majority, you need sectoral bargaining, you need state support. But that, of course, does not mean that union power is unimportant. It's, of course, still important for two reasons. The first, of course, is it's not a good idea for labor just to rely on state support, of course. And we saw that coming back to the beginning of my presentation when I was talking about Europe and these neoliberal policies, and they imposed these reform programs, especially on Southern Europe and so on. Here, exactly, we had the case that the state stopped its support for the system and the unions were too weak to defend it. So of course, it is important also to have union power in order to stabilize the system, and also to have union power not only at the enterprise level, but also at the political level to make sure that the state is fulfilling this function. The second reason is, of course, and I can't talk about that, but just to mention it, high bargaining coverage, everyone has an agreement, does not automatically mean that everyone has a good agreement. So in order to have a good agreement, of course, again, you need union power. Without that, you won't get a good agreement, I would say. Well, so there's a little bit of commercial. If you are in advertisement, if you are interested in particular countries in Europe, in the bargaining system of that countries, if you want to have more in-depth case studies, I recommend a 4-volume book of the European Trade Union Institute, including a very nice chapter on Germany written by myself and a colleague. And the good thing, it's for free. You can download all the stuff from the webpage of the ETUI, so that's very great. There is also a similar book which looks more on the trade union structure, again with a very interesting cover chapter on Germany in here. But as I just would recommend, because I think these are very two standard books you also could use. I use them also for teaching and so on. So it's I think quite good to use them. So what is the process now at the EU level with these with the implementation of this collective bargaining aspect of the directive? So as I already said, the good thing is that it's already working. So always in most countries, strengthening of collective bargaining is on the political agenda. They need to have these concrete action plans until the end of this year. And we already have some draft action plans also from some countries. But finally, the concrete measures and outcomes, since the directive does not have the competence to determine concrete measure, concrete instrument, the outcome will always depend on the struggle at national level. And so therefore you will have good examples and bad examples in the end. So it really depends on this. Just give you a very brief overview about what is discussed among these action plans. Of course, it is discussed on the one hand, it's about capacity building, both for unions, but also for employers' organization. Quite often we have, if you want to have sectoral bargaining, you simply have the problem there is no sectoral employers' organization to bargain with. So you have to create them or to support them, or you have to set up this traditional wage council, bargaining council by the state, which then obliged employers to take part of the negotiations. So these are different approaches discussed. We have, of course, the extension mechanism. In Germany at the moment, we have a big debate and a draft law on public contracts and collective bargaining. So to give public contracts only to companies who are covered by collective agreements as one big incentive here. So there are a huge variety of things which are under discussion. Well, that's already the third point. So I can stop here again, and before I give you my view on the US and Canada. So
Super. Merci. Est-ce qu'en ligne, il y aurait des questions ou des interventions? Bien. Michel.
On peut pas t'entendre, Michel, et on ne te voit pas.
Bon, excuse me for that. Okay. Now you see me, I think. I'm
Yes.
sorry. Okay,
Right.
just a short question. I've read your paper with Thorsten Müller.
yeah,
Yeah, the second one. And
Yeah.
it was in 23, 2023. And
yeah,
I felt a lot depressed reading that because you speak of the erosion of collective bargaining in Germany, a relative erosion of collective bargaining, and a decline also of the work councils.
right.
With the impact of the EU directive, things are changing? Is there more hope for a renewal of collective bargaining in Germany?
Yeah, I would say in the sense that especially the unions, but also, let's say, more progressive labor-oriented forces in Germany, they heavily try to use the European directive and to say, well, we have to increase our minimum wage. We have to set up an action plan now to increase collective bargaining again. And I think what they managed at least is that it's really clearly on the political agenda. And almost everyone, including the conservative, probably with the exception of the far right, but all the other parties in principle say, yeah, we need to do something about the strengthening of collective bargaining. And then, of course, the struggle is going about the concrete instruments and how effective they are. And this is an ongoing struggle at the moment. As I said, we just recently brought into Parliament a draft bill on public procurement and collective bargaining. So this is one issue at the moment which is heavily debated. And yeah, I would be not too negative. So we at least managed to get the discourse, and now of course we need to get substantial results. That's in the process we are at the moment. But yeah, I would say there is also some reason for hope that we will make some progress on that. But of course, everything is contested. Business community, or large part of the business community, are still very much against it. And yeah, there are also unfortunately some signs of a little bit of more rollback, also at Germany, but also at EU level. You see it quite clearly. So yeah, but we'll see what the outcome is. But in any case, this directive is used as a political instrument at national level. That I would say is very clear.
Merci. Alessandro?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Thorsten, for the conference. I'm talking from Switzerland. We have a quite complicated debate around the articulation. On one hand, the collective bargaining agreements, and on the other hand, the minimum wage. And you said, Thorsten, at some point that it's not enough to have a collective agreement. It has to be a good collective agreement. And I wanted to hear you about the dialectics between the minimum wage and collective agreement levels, because the decrease of collective agreements is not only quantitative, it's also qualitative. At least in Switzerland, we have a decrease of level of wages in the collective agreements. And it sounds as if, as long as you have a high percentage of coverage, you don't need the state to come in. But actually, it's a bit more complicated. I wanted to hear you about how can one be used for raising also the levels of wages in collective agreements, for instance.
Yeah, thanks for the questioning. Greetings to Switzerland. I mean, I remember when I was invited to your national campaign for minimum wage some years ago. Well, yeah, we made at our institute, we made a big project on the interconnection and the complementarity of minimum wages and collective bargaining in Germany. So I can, on the background of that perspective, I can say a few words. There are also big reports on that. So if you're interested in more in the details, I can give you the reference, of course. So basically, first of all, I think you're right. We have also in some sectors, we have agreements where both unions, but usually also employers association, but in particular unions are very weak. Classical, let's say, hotels and restaurants, for example. I mean, the union density is below 10% or something like that. But they still have an agreement, since the employers have some self-interest in having a kind of wage floor. But the agreements are very low. And what we saw in the past, that when we introduced the statutory minimum wage, we saw that sometimes the statutory minimum wage was higher than the lowest wages agreed within the collective bargaining, for instance, in hotel and restaurants, but also in some other service sectors. And what we see here is really that the unions were able to use these incentive coming from the statutory minimum wage, even to also push for collectively agreed wages. So it has a clear positive function that you have a higher minimum wage also on the collective agreements. There were also some unions who were afraid, saying, okay, if we have this higher minimum wage, maybe the employers have no interest in collective bargaining any longer. That might be a threat theoretically. In practice, we haven't seen that really, that because of the minimum wages, employers stop bargaining. There are maybe one or two very tiny examples where there is a case, but they also had such bad collective agreement that for the workers probably not better, or it's even better to have a wage determined by the state than a very low wage determined by collective bargaining. But in general, I would say both instruments are complementary, and for instance, but also many unions in Germany were able to negotiate where some kind of what's the name in English, a certain clause that whenever the minimum wage is increased, the lowest wages in the bargaining should be at least, let's say, €1 above this minimum wage or something like that. So clear clauses who define a difference towards the statutory minimum wage, because I mean, indeed, the idea of collective bargaining and the understanding of the unions is to have a better condition than that was provided by the state. So in that sense, I think this interaction is really necessary. Right.
Merci. Mathieu?
Oui, bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Oui.
So hi, Thorsten, Mathieu Dupuis from Laval University. Thanks for your presentation. At the end of your presentation, you mentioned the fact that we should also think about union strength. And I will say not only think, I think it's crucial. I think it's a prerequisite of strong sectoral bargaining. So my question is quite straightforward, but maybe not simple, is before thinking of strengthening sectoral bargaining, how you can strengthen also union power in Europe.
So, well, first of all, I think I won't agree to a hierarchy here. So, I mean, in the debate also in Germany, I mean, if you would ask a German trade unionist, of course, you would say how to strengthen collective bargaining. Yeah, strengthen the unions. And there, I mean, with all the sympathy for and the need for these strengthening of trade unions, I would say it's also sometimes you should be aware that you're not, or be careful that you're not following a myth. So my thesis would be, and I will come back to that when I talk about US and Canada, my thesis would be, it is really a myth that you could believe to get a majority of workers covered by collective agreement only through organizing. I know no example in the world where this is really happening. So this, as I said, this does not mean that we do not have to care about the strengthening of labor power. And of course, if I go to the European debate, there are a lot of things. First of all, a very big issue is also to stop union busting practices, and also to ban them, and to have higher fines against companies who are using this union busting. Really, so having a clear thing here. Then, of course, you can have all kind of incentives to become a union member. Even financial incentives are discussed. And certainly, and that's probably the most important point, is, of course, union policy itself. I would say the approach, how unions, for instance, are engaged in collective bargaining and so forth. The whole question of union democracy, the question of how you really activize your members, that the members becoming part of your policy, and you really say goodbye to these old style, like we, the unions, doing the job for you. No, we have to do it together. I mean, all these kinds of debate about participation of members, active participation of members within collective bargaining. I think these are the crucial things. And there are a lot of debates and a lot of proposals going on also in Europe, also in the light of this directive, how to strengthen that. All right.
I'll have a last question on the third block before you give us advice for the future of Canada, and we'll let the United States apart. But the second part of the directive seems to me quite heavier in terms of obligation for the states. At least what I read, they need to have an action plan on the extent of collective bargaining. And in your paper, which is now a few months old, you had the time to examine some of those action plan. Did you have more time to examine them? Are they complete, or it's mostly like a declaration of intention, or did the countries take seriously that directive in the elaboration of their action plan?
What we analyzed in the older paper so far were the different attempts and policy we saw already at national level. The final action, most countries are now in the process of finalizing the concrete action plan, because the schedule at the end of this year. So and as I said, I only saw a couple of draft action plans from some countries. And of course, I mean, the quality of them are very different. Many of them are, like you were saying, they bring in some intentions, but you never know what's going out from there. So, and again, but what I think, I mean, so the action plan itself won't solve the problem, but what the good thing I think is about these action plans is that they set up a framework and a procedure where it is clear these issues are permanently on the agenda. They are monitored at national level, but also at EU level. So the European Commission is monitoring it. So, and it gives trade unions and other progressive forces, gives a framework which they can use in order to bring in their demands and really to try to reach something in substance. But these outcomes, of course, are not determined. It's open. It's a question of struggles in the end, what the outcome will be.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Yeah, should I say a final words, and then we probably, I don't know, we'll still have some time for the general debate.
We have time.
We have time. Okay, so just a few words about my studying, especially on the US and also on Canada, but on Canada, as I said, I have more questions than answers, of course. In the US, so this is a very long-term picture of the US model, union density and bargaining coverage. You can see that when it's come to bargaining coverage, it's very close to the union density, it's only slightly above that. But the interesting picture here, which, I mean, I knew it before, but sometimes you need to see such things in order to have this aha effect and saying, well, that's the American system, that even in the high days of US industrial relations in the 1940s and 50s, it was only a model for minority. So maybe it also influenced the non-covered to a certain extent. So the influence might be a little bit wider, but you never reached really to have a majority of workers covered by collective agreement. Never. So, and that's a fundamental difference to many European systems, I would say, and that's quite so. And I looked also to the figures from Canada. I only found them since the 1960s. So here I found, first of all, I found it quite interesting that the development, in contrast to many other countries, are relatively stable. I mean, you had some increase in the 1970s, and you have also some decrease in the 80s and 90s. But since the 90s, it's almost about 32% or so coverage. But nevertheless, even here, and I don't have figures before 1960s, but you might know, I would assume you never had covered a majority of workers in Canada. It was only 1/3, roughly speaking, about 1/3. So that's so again, also your system is fundamentally different in that sense from at least the Western European countries, which have the idea of covering the majority of workers. So that's right. See, and of course, part of the story of Canada, as far as I understood it, is of course this difference between public and private sector. So you have a relatively strong system in the public sector where you really have a majority of the workers covered. And I would love to know more about that. Why is that the case? Maybe it's about because in the public sector you have some forms of sectoral bargaining, I would assume that would be said. But if you look only to the private sector, it is a tiny minority, and it's also looking pretty much similar to the US. So it's a little bit better. So the coverage rates and the density are a little bit higher, but in general, it's very close to what we see in the US as well. So that was what I understood from the Canadian system. And finally, and that is more a question to you, of course, you see there's regional difference, quite significant. And I would really love to, if you have an explanation for that, what are the basic thing of these regional differences? Are they related to also the question of the public sector, or does it even does the decree system of Quebec has an effect on the bargaining coverage or not? So these are the things I would be interested to know from you to understand why you have these differences here in Canada. Yeah, to conclude, I would say, yeah, as I said already, both systems, so the US and Canada, are systems, at least in the private sector, of mainly enterprise bargaining, and they have always, even in the high days, have only covered a minority of workers. And here again, my thesis, which maybe is a little bit provocative also for trade unionists, a comprehensive bargaining system of collective bargaining, you won't get only through organizing. I know no example in the world where this happened, that you got it. So you rely in a certain way on the, if you want to have a more comprehensive system, which really covers the majority of workers, you need some form of sector bargaining, and you also need some form of state support. And in order to make sure that this state support is in a good direction, of course, you need also strong unions to push for that. And so here the circle comes in. And as I said, of course, a good agreement you got only with stronger unions. So that's also for sure. So these are the and I like to end with a quote which I found very nice. Yeah, and you see, no, before I come to go, you see, I was very impressed to see in the US that there is a very rich debate on sectoral bargaining. In the meantime, I collect more than 50 articles, papers, whatsoever on sectoral bargaining, which were recently, let's say, from the last 5 years. So it's very interesting what's going on there. I had the chance, before I come here, I was in Boston, and I had the chance to give a talk at Harvard Law School, where they have this Center for Labor and a Just Economy, it's called. And they came forward with a quite comprehensive proposal how to reform the US system of industrial relations in general, but in collective bargaining in particular. So I think there were very interesting debates going on. Also, we of course all know that at the moment, the political implementation of it is not very likely, but nevertheless, I mean, if you have a chance and if you come at a certain point to an alternative political thing, you need to have concepts, ideas, how to go forward. I also looked to Canada. I also found in Canada that you have a couple of debates here on going on. And of course, I would be very keen and interested to hear your views about that. What do you think about that? And now I want to finish with a quote which I found very nice, and this is a quote for Mr. Wagner, which I understand had with the famous Wagner Act, but which also had quite a strong influence for Canada, for the Canadian system. Robert Wagner, who was a German, by the way, so he came to the US as a small child with his family from Germany in, I think, the late 19th century somewhere, and then become later on the senator of New York State, and of course the name Wagner Act comes from his name. And before the Wagner Act was adopted in 1935, he wrote, among others, an article in the New York Times about what he thinks the Wagner and the reform of industrial relations in the US should be. And it was very interesting because he was not arguing in favor of an enterprise bargaining system that time. It's more on the opposite. I mean, he was, first of all, he was very critical of what he called the system of company unions. Company unions at that time were mostly unions which were very close to management or even set up by the management and so on, said this is not the way how to go. But if you really want to draw on the wage question and bargaining in general, we have to look for much broader spectrum, and it's important really to regulate it on whole industry, states, or even the nation, he said. And he said it's a need of the workers really to unite and to create larger units in order to make sure that they got a just share of national wealth. So that's also it. And it's very interesting to see. So the intention, and I read also some articles about all these New Deal guys, that was pretty different from what then finally, and especially then after the 1940s and 50s, has been developed in the States. So, and then to think about a reform now about system always is interesting to look to the history and to look to the historical origins of that. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.